She stood in her white gown, minutes away from walking down the aisle. The man she loved was waiting at the altar. Their families had flown in from across the country. 200 guests sat in wooden pews, whispering excitedly about the ceremony to come. But in a small room behind the church sanctuary, something was happening that would destroy everything. What began as a fairy tale was about to become the most devastating betrayal anyone in that church had ever witnessed. And the truth? The truth would expose secrets that had been buried for years. This is the story of Emma and David, two people who thought they had found forever, only to discover that the person they trusted most had been living a lie. What happened on their wedding day didn't just end a marriage before it began. It unraveled an entire community's faith and revealed a pattern of manipulation that had destroyed lives long before Emma ever said yes to David's proposal. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David had always been the kind of man who believed in doing things right. He grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the son of a factory worker and a school secretary. His parents taught him that hard work, honesty, and faith were the pillars of good life. He went to church every Sunday, volunteered at community events, and saved money carefully so that one day he could provide for a family of his own. When he met Emma at a friend's barbecue 3 years before their wedding day, he felt like all that patience had finally paid off. She was a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that made everyone around her smile. She loved old movies, baking banana bread on Sunday mornings, and writing thank you notes by hand. She was, in every way, the kind of woman David had prayed for. Their relationship moved at a comfortable pace. They went on hikes together, cooked dinners in David's tiny apartment, and talked for hours about their dreams. Emma wanted to open a small bookstore someday. David wanted to build furniture in his garage and maybe sell it at craft fairs. They were simple dreams, but they were theirs. After 2 years of dating, David proposed on a beach at sunset, and Emma said yes without hesitation. She cried happy tears, and David felt like the luckiest man alive. They set a date for the following spring and began planning a wedding at the church where David had grown up. It was the same church where his parents had been married, where he had been baptized, where he had learned what it meant to be a man of faith. The church was led by Father Marcus, a charismatic man in his mid-40s who had been serving the congregation for nearly a decade. He had a warm smile, a deep voice that commanded attention during sermons, and a reputation for being approachable. People loved him. He counseled troubled marriages, visited the sick, and ran youth programs that kept teenagers engaged. When David and Emma began their premarital counseling sessions with Father Marcus, it felt like the natural next step. Every couple getting married at the church was required to attend 6 sessions over 3 months. The sessions were supposed to help couples discuss important topics like finances, communication, conflict resolution, and intimacy. Father Marcus assured them it would strengthen their relationship and prepare them for the challenges of married life. At first, the sessions went smoothly. David and Emma would meet Father Marcus in his office on Thursday evenings. They would sit on a worn leather couch while he asked them questions from a workbook. What are your long-term goals? How do you handle disagreements? What does commitment mean to you? David answered honestly, and Emma nodded along, sometimes adding her own thoughts. But as the weeks went on, David started noticing small changes. Emma seemed quieter during the sessions. She would stare at her hands or glance at the clock. A few times, she mentioned feeling tired and asked if they could reschedule. David didn't think much of it at the time. Planning a wedding was stressful, and Emma had a demanding job. He figured she just needed rest. What David didn't know was that Father Marcus had begun scheduling additional sessions with Emma alone. He told her it was standard practice for brides who seemed anxious about marriage. He said it would help her process any doubts or fears privately, without the pressure of David being in the room. Emma trusted him. After all, he was a priest. He was supposed to be a safe person, someone who cared about her spiritual well-being. So she agreed. The first few solo sessions felt harmless. Father Marcus asked her about her childhood, her relationship with her parents, her faith journey. He listened intently, nodding and offering what seemed like thoughtful advice. But slowly the tone shifted. He started asking more personal questions. How did she feel about physical intimacy? Did she feel truly loved by David? Was she sure she wasn't settling? Emma felt uncomfortable, but she didn't want to be rude. She told herself that maybe these were normal questions for premarital counseling. Maybe she was overthinking it. But then Father Marcus started touching her arm when they talked. He would lean in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told her she was special, that he could see a light in her that others missed. He said David was a good man, but he wondered aloud if David truly understood her the way he did. Emma's stomach twisted with confusion. She wanted to leave, but she also felt guilty for even thinking something was wrong. This was a man of God. She must be misinterpreting things. She must be the problem. By the time the wedding day arrived, Emma was exhausted. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with anxieties she couldn't name. She loved David. She wanted to marry him, but something felt wrong, and she didn't know how to explain it. That morning, she woke up in a hotel room with her bridesmaids, who were laughing and sipping champagne. They helped her into her dress, a delicate lace gown with a long train. They curled her hair and applied her makeup. They told her she looked like a princess. Emma smiled, but inside, she felt hollow. She kept thinking about the last solo session she'd had with Father Marcus 2 days earlier. He had told her he needed to speak with her alone before the wedding. He said it was important. She had agreed, assuming it was some final blessing or prayer. The church was decorated beautifully. White roses lined the pews. Candles flickered on every windowsill. The organ played softly as guests arrived. David stood at the altar in his dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked nervous but happy. His best man clapped him on the shoulder and whispered something that made David laugh. Everything seemed perfect. The ceremony was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. By 1:45, the bridesmaids were lined up in the church hallway, clutching their bouquets. The flower girl practiced walking in a straight line. The photographer snapped candid shots of guests hugging and chatting. But Emma was nowhere to be found. David checked his watch. He whispered to his best man, asking if anyone had seen her. The best man shrugged and said she was probably just touching up her makeup. But as the minutes ticked by, David's concern grew. By 2 o'clock, the guests were starting to murmur. The organist kept playing the same prelude song on repeat. David's mother squeezed his hand and told him not to worry. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He excused himself and walked down the corridor toward the bridal suite. He knocked gently on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. His heart pounded in his chest. He tried the handle. The door was locked. Panic rising, he walked further down the hall, past the church kitchen, past the storage closets, toward Father Marcus's office. That's when he heard it. A muffled sound. A voice. Emma's voice. David's breath caught in his throat. He walked slowly toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The door to Father Marcus's office was slightly ajar. Through the crack, David could see movement. He pushed the door open. What he saw in that moment would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Emma was standing against the wall, her wedding dress wrinkled, her face streaked with tears. Father Marcus stood in front of her, his hand on her shoulder, his face too close to hers. The moment the door opened, they both froze. Emma's eyes went wide with shock and shame. Father Marcus stepped back quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like annoyance. David couldn't speak. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Emma began sobbing, her hands covering her face. She kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over again. David looked at Father Marcus, waiting for an explanation, waiting for something that would make this make sense. But Father Marcus said nothing. He just stared at David with cold, calculating eyes. David turned and walked out of the room. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked down the hallway, past the guests, past his parents, out the front doors of the church. He got in his car and drove. He didn't know where he was going. He just drove until his hands stopped shaking and his vision stopped blurring with tears. Back at the church, chaos erupted. Emma collapsed onto the floor of Father Marcus's office, unable to stop crying. One of the bridesmaids found her and immediately called for help. Guests began whispering furiously, trying to piece together what had happened. David's mother demanded answers. Emma's father stormed into Father Marcus's office and shouted at him, his face red with rage. Father Marcus remained calm, insisting that nothing inappropriate had happened. He claimed Emma had come to him upset and crying, asking for prayer before the ceremony. He said David had misunderstood what he saw, but no one believed him. The wedding was canceled. Guests filed out of the church in stunned silence. The reception hall sat empty, untouched plates of food growing cold. In the days that followed, Emma tried to reach David. She called him over and over, leaving voicemails that were barely coherent through her tears. She sent him text messages, begging him to let her explain. But David didn't respond. He stayed at a friend's house, refusing to see anyone. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and broken. He couldn't understand how the woman he loved and the priest he trusted could do this to him. He replayed every moment of their relationship in his mind, searching for clues he had missed. Had Emma been in love with Father Marcus all along? Had their entire relationship been a lie? The questions tormented him. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He felt like his entire world had collapsed. But then, something unexpected happened. Emma's best friend, a woman named Rachel, showed up at David's friend's house. She knocked on the door until David finally answered. She looked him in the eye and said, "You need to hear the truth." David hesitated, but something in her voice made him listen. Rachel told him everything. She told him about the solo counseling sessions Father Marcus had insisted on. She told him about the inappropriate questions, the manipulation, the way Father Marcus had slowly isolated Emma and made her feel confused and ashamed. She told him that Emma had been terrified to tell anyone because she thought no one would believe her. She thought people would blame her. And she had been right. The moment David walked into that office, everyone assumed the worst about her. David felt sick. He realized that what he had seen wasn't an affair. It was something far worse. Emma hadn't been unfaithful. She had been victimized by someone in a position of power, someone who had used his authority and her trust to manipulate her. David immediately called Emma. When she answered, her voice was hoarse from crying. They met in person that evening, sitting in a quiet park as the sun set. Emma told him everything, her voice shaking with shame and fear. She told him how Father Marcus had made her feel special at first, then slowly began crossing boundaries. She told him how confused she had felt, how she had questioned her own instincts. She told him that on the day of the wedding, Father Marcus had called her into his office under the pretense of a final blessing, but then he had cornered her, telling her she belonged with him, not David. David listened, his heart breaking all over again. But this time, it wasn't because of betrayal. It was because the woman he loved had been suffering alone, and he hadn't known. He held her as she cried, and he promised her that they would get through this together. They would find a way to make sure Father Marcus never did this to anyone else. Over the next few weeks, David and Emma began digging. They talked to other women in the church, asking careful questions. What they discovered was horrifying. Father Marcus had been doing this for years. There were at least 4 other women who had experienced similar manipulation during counseling sessions. Some had been engaged. Some had been struggling in their marriages. All of them had been vulnerable, and all of them had been exploited. Most had been too ashamed or afraid to speak up. They thought no one would believe them. They thought they would be blamed. David and Emma gathered evidence. They collected testimony from the women who were willing to come forward. They documented inappropriate messages Father Marcus had sent. They presented everything to the church leadership, demanding action. At first, the church tried to handle it quietly. They offered to relocate Father Marcus to another parish. They suggested counseling and supervision. But David and Emma refused to let it go. They contacted a lawyer. They filed a formal complaint with the diocese. They went public with their story, speaking to local news outlets and sharing their experience on social media. The response was overwhelming. More women came forward, not just from their church, but from other parishes where Father Marcus had served in the past. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse that had been ignored for over a decade. Church leaders had received complaints before, but they had dismissed them or quietly shuffled Father Marcus to a new location. They had prioritized the reputation of the institution over the safety of the people they were supposed to protect. The public outrage was intense. Protests were held outside the church. Survivors shared their stories. The diocese was forced to take action. Father Marcus was removed from ministry. Criminal charges were filed. A trial was scheduled. But the damage had already been done. Lives had been shattered. Families had been torn apart. Faith had been broken. For Emma and David, the road to healing was long and painful. They postponed their wedding indefinitely. They went to therapy, both individually and together. They had to rebuild trust, not just in each other, but in themselves. Emma struggled with guilt and shame, even though she knew intellectually that none of it was her fault. David struggled with anger and grief, haunted by the image of Emma standing in that office, crying and confused. But slowly, they began to heal. They leaned on each other. They leaned on friends and family. They found a new church, one that took abuse seriously and had systems in place to protect vulnerable people. And a year later, they got married in a small ceremony on a beach, surrounded by the people who had stood by them through the darkest time of their lives. The trial of Father Marcus was long and difficult. Several women testified, recounting their experiences in painful detail. Father Marcus maintained his innocence, claiming the women had misunderstood his intentions. His defense attorney argued that he had been counseling troubled individuals and that his actions had been misinterpreted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, emails, and testimony from multiple victims painted a clear picture of manipulation and abuse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the verdict came back, Father Marcus was found guilty on multiple counts of sexual misconduct. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The church issued a public apology and committed to implementing new policies to prevent future abuse. But for many, the apology felt hollow. The damage had been done. Trust had been broken. And while justice had been served in a legal sense, the emotional and spiritual scars remained. Emma and David became advocates for survivors of clergy abuse. They spoke at conferences, shared their story in interviews, and worked with organizations dedicated to reforming church policies. They wanted to make sure that what happened to them never happened to anyone else. They wanted survivors to know they weren't alone, that they had nothing to be ashamed of, and that speaking up was an act of courage, not weakness. Looking back on that day, David often thinks about the moment he opened the door to Father Marcus's office. He used to wish he had never walked down that hallway. He used to wish he had just waited at the altar, oblivious to what was happening behind closed doors. But now, he realizes that opening that door was the moment everything changed. It was the moment the truth came to light. It was the moment Emma was finally freed from the manipulation that had been suffocating her. And it was the moment a predator was finally exposed. It wasn't the wedding day they had planned. It wasn't the beginning they had dreamed of. But in a strange way, it was the moment their real story began. The story of two people who faced unimaginable pain and chose to fight for justice, for healing, and for each other. So here's the question I want you to think about. If you were in David's position, if you opened that door and saw someone you loved in that situation, what would you do? Would you walk away? Would you listen? Would you fight for the truth, even if it meant facing something painful? And if you were Emma, if you had been manipulated and made to feel like it was your fault, would you have had the courage to speak up? These aren't easy questions, but they're important ones. Because stories like this aren't just about one couple or one church. They're about power, trust, and the courage it takes to stand up when something is wrong. Let me know in the comments what you think. How would you have reacted? Do you think justice was truly served? And have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Real stories, hard stories, stories that matter. And next time, I'm going to tell you about a bride who discovered her billionaire mother-in-law was hiding a secret that would destroy the entire family. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. And remember, the truth always finds a way to come out, even when people try to keep it buried.